Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is, quite naturally, Russia and Ukraine, and now add on the Holocaust. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine on Thursday, February 24th, one question has plagued countless numbers of people. It is a question that I've been asked more than any other single question about the carnage being perpetrated by Putin's Russian forces in Ukraine. The question goes something like this. We condemned the United States and the Allies for not bombing Auschwitz, or at least for not bombing the railroad tracks. So now, how can we not demand that the United States and NATO bomb Russian forces in Ukraine? If you follow the thinking, the question makes sense. The motivation of these questioners is a deep-seated desire of good people to help those in desperate need. Good people want to stop the murder and the senseless deaths of innocent civilians. Good people want to stop the suffering that they are reading about and watching every day. They do not want to turn the page. They don't want to change the channel. They want to stop and actively stop the slaughter and maiming and destruction. They're drawing the historical parallel between Adolf Hitler and Vladimir Putin. And they hope that the argument they are presenting will achieve two purposes. They hope it will achieve decision makers and activate the decision makers to make bold decisions to enter the fray. And they hope that it will also solve, at least soothe, their personal internal dilemma of not standing idly by while a person's blood is shed, which is Leviticus 19:16. The lessons of history of the Holocaust are clear. Good people do not want to be bystanders in the presence of evil. Good people feel for others. They know, in the very essence of their being, just how disturbing the images of the atrocities perpetrated by the Russians on Ukrainian civilians truly are. The sheer horror of the mass murders and the destruction leaves good people quaking. And that now, 80 years later, after Hitler, this kind of murder is still possible and happening is to them unfathomable. And they feel it. They cannot stand idly by or ignore it. It's not a simple question. It never was. And this is how I begin to answer it. Historians have debated the big question for years. Would the bombing of Nazi gas chambers and crematoria and even the train lines have made a difference? Would it have saved lives? The Roosevelt administration argued that winning the war would save lives. The sooner the war was won, the better the overall situation. That they should not divert energy and resources from winning the war to saving Jews from the Nazi murder machine? That's the question. The argument, though, has its problems. The first is that the RAF, the Royal Air Force, did bomb Auschwitz. They bombed Auschwitz III, also known as Buna. It was a ball bearing factory that made engines for the Nazi war effort. The main factory of death was Auschwitz II, better known as Birkenau. Birkenau housed 4 gas chambers and 4 crematoria, 2 sets of 2. They were very large. A 5th smaller gas chamber and crematoria were in Auschwitz I, which housed the administration buildings for the entire Auschwitz camps. There were no smart bombs then, and there were no precision bombings, no smart bombs at all. So some bombs landed actually close to Birkenau. Bombing the camps would have caused many innocent deaths. Would it have been worth it? Over the years, survivors have told me that they would have gladly sacrificed their own lives if it meant the end of the gas chambers and crematoria of Birkenau. Had they been bombed, would it have been a statement, at least, that the Allies cared about saving lives? That's possible. But today, things are different. One difference is that there are smart bombs, very precise GPS directional locator bombs. So precise that they can actually be directed to literally hit inside of an air vent. The biggest difference is that during the Holocaust, World War II was in full swing, and the United States was already involved in the war. The United States was running airstrikes against Nazi targets, and yes, while hitting the gas chambers would have been a slight redirection of several missions, they were already in the war. And there was no NATO during the war. NATO was created after World War II to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union. Today, NATO, with the United States as its leader, is watching from the sidelines. They are helping their friends in Ukraine, but they're still on the sidelines. So once again, these good people are asking, at what point does the moral imperative to intervene, to save lives, even if it means getting involved and potentially sparking another world war, that could involve Russia, United States, NATO, China, North Korea, and Iran take precedence. When does the moral imperative kick in? Undeniably, if NATO were to intercede, many more innocent people would die. That is a given even without the possibility of nuclear weaponry. Crossing that threshold of the nuclear war between Russia and Ukraine is a big deal. If that were to happen, the world we live in would be altered dramatically. I do not have confidence that Putin, North Korea, or Iran would keep their fingers off the nuclear button if they were losing. Doomsday scenario, not a mutually assured destruction mad scenario, would emerge. While yes, even in ethically charged moments, we have to do our best to save as many lives as we can. But ethically as well, we must also be mindful of making a decision that might cause even more damage, and horrific damage, that is. In the end, most people realize how potentially catastrophic a misstep can be. And the good people that they are, they finally realize that they were thinking with their hearts and not with their heads. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from Ynet. It was written by Ben Dror Yemini. It was published April 8th. The title of the column is Israel May Not Prevail in the Face of Global Intellectual Anti-Semitism. Subtitled, Opinion, Middle East Studies Association Decision to Endorse the BDS Poses Dangers Beyond Those Israel Has Had to Contend With So Far, from Iran to local terror groups, since it's a new manifestation of Nazi ideology. Ben Dror Yemini addresses the sheer hatred and even Nazism of BDS. This is how he begins. Just one day after the deadly terror attack in Beersheba, where 4 civilians were killed and several others wounded, the Middle East Studies Association announced their decision to ratify the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS resolution. If we seek to understand the anti-Semitic jihadist terror is alive and kicking, we need only to remember that it has the support of integral parts of Western academia. The BDS remains the propaganda wing and the intellectual arm of terrorism aimed against Israel. Many terror groups operated in recent years all over the world, from the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia to the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Most of these groups are no longer active, but Islamist terror is, and is growing. The numbers are chilling, and Ben Dror now gives us details of how the hate they spewed in Israel's direction. He writes, upwards of 250,000 people have been murdered by jihadists over the past 2 decades. Not all movements and groups among the jihadists are the same, but they all share the hope for an Islamic caliphate that must ultimately rule the world and destroy Israel, to be followed by a subsequent annihilation of all Jews. Prominent Sunni religious authority Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, in one of his recent sermons, called for his flock to finish, quote, what Hitler started, unquote. Iran-backed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said that it was good that the Jews congregated in Israel because there will be no need to chase them around the globe, and in Israel the final solution could be implemented to the end. Ben Dror Yemini continues explaining the need for terrorists to have intellectual leaders whose function is to convince others to take up their charge. He asserts that, like other groups, BDS does exactly that. Ben Dror writes, these groups do not exist in a vacuum. They're supported by those who consider themselves progressive and enlightened. No murderous call to arms will succeed without intellectuals backing it. Italian philosopher Gianni Vittamino once wrote, when former Iranian President Mohammad Ahmadinejad calls to wipe Israel off the map, he merely expresses a demand that should be more explicitly shared by democratic countries that instead consider him an enemy. British philosopher Ted Hundrich, meanwhile, went straight to the point. In his use of academic jargon, he justified Palestinian terror as, quote, moral right. It's their moral right. In his conclusion, Yemini points out that Israel confronts both physical enemies like Iran and intellectual enemies like BDS. He writes, Fatimo and Hundrich and anyone who votes in favor of the PDS are the same. They are complicit in the campaign of hate and horrendous propaganda, all to demonize the only Jewish state in the world. In the past, Mesa had reportedly rejected the BDS, and its members understood acceptance of that movement would constitute crossing a red line, but no more. Now Israel faces Iran and terror movements on the one side, and intellectual, racist, and anti-Semitic activism on the other. Israel will overcome the former, but may not prevail when faced with the latter. Another excellent piece by Ben Dror Yamini. Next up is a column by Yossi Yehoshua. This column, too, comes from Ynet. It was published on April 5th. It's entitled, Israeli Security Officials Only Raise Tensions Instead of Calming Them. Subtitled opinion, Senior Officials, Constant Updates on the Number of Attacks Security Forces Managed to Foil is wrong for many reasons, the main of which is that it does not boost the public's sense of personal security. The subtitle explains his thesis in a very interesting and insightful manner. Yehoshua begins, anyone who was born in Israel before the current decade knows without question that in the past we have had much deadlier terror waves than the one we are experiencing now. But even though the number of casualties in the first and second intifadas was sadly much higher than the 11 people killed in the past few weeks, we haven't heard such loud voices of intimidation and stress coming from our senior officials. So, what is the difference this time around? Ironically, Israel's security officials are also concerned with this question, even though they contribute directly to the current panic. The IDF and Israeli police are sharing information about the range of their activities, among other things, to miscalculations that led to the attacks in Beersheba, Hadera, and Bnei Brak. Yehoshua posits that the IDF Chief of Staff should know better, he writes. For example, Monday, IDF Chief of Staff Avi Kochavi, who was commander of the paratroopers during the large-scale military operation in the West Bank in 2002, known as Operation Defensive Shield, said he understands why the public is hysterical since we have witnessed worse and longer terror waves than the latest one, and he is right. He, however, was the one who stood in front of the cameras telling us that we have foiled at least 10 terror attacks in the past 2 weeks, knowing that most of them had nothing to do with the current escalation and were part of the security forces' routine work. Kochavi must have known those remarks would immediately make headlines, at least in some media outlets. Yehoshua now suggests that negative results could emerge from this new policy. Therefore, he writes, when senior security officials echo the public panic, even if they try to make up for the past mistakes, it is unequivocally wrong. Those who consciously produce headlines about thwarted terror attacks must understand that it doesn't increase the sense of security. On the contrary, every day we have warnings about potential attacks for the simple reason that we live in a bad neighborhood of the world. What may come out of this constant need to report foiled attacks is an even greater animosity towards the security forces. He concludes, so contrary to the claim of some former generals, the people of Israel haven't become weaker. It's just some Israelis are experiencing the trauma of terror attacks for the first time. In a world that has changed, especially in a way that it consumes its media, anxiety is a natural and obvious response, and we could all help each other in calming it down. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 7 cartoons today. The first cartoon makes fun of the mask mandate. Vincent van Gogh is trying to enter a building. He's told that he can't enter the exhibit. His mask is hanging from one ear. The person tells him, I'm sorry, Mr. Van Gogh, you can't come in here without a mask. Now, of course, the mask is hanging from one ear because Vincent van Gogh cut off his other ear. The next cartoon is a very, very funny set of never asks. Never asks a woman her age, a man his salary, a German why their grandfather is from Argentina. This is one of those very, very funny lines that will be lost in a few years. After the Holocaust, many Nazis found refuge in Argentina. It's part of a history many students are never taught. This next meme is too funny to even explain. The sign shows a parent holding a baby just out of reach of an alligator's mouth. The caption in the meme reads, well, there's no circle thingy with a slash through it, so I suppose it's okay. These next 3 cartoons deal with Ukraine and Putin because it's all over the place. Putin asks his generals, so how's it going? The map of Ukraine is on the wall, and his generals are on the other end of that long table. Only in place of live generals is a collection of gravestones because many of his generals have been killed in Ukraine. This next cartoon is of a couple having cocktails. The man raises his goblet to the woman who is reading the newspaper. The man says, "May we live to see wars fueled by windmills and solar panels." The headline on the paper the woman is reading shouts, "Ukraine war paid for by oil sales to Europe." This is one of the funny and many cartoons that poke fun on the ongoing policy that Russia is still exporting oil and gas to the very people that are fighting him. The next cartoon is a map highlighting what is and what is not Russia. Ukraine is in dark blue, not Russia. Almost everything else on the map, other than Russia, is labeled not Russia. Interestingly, they added Crimea to be not Russia, but in 2014, Crimea became part of Russia. Finally, this last meme makes fun of sanctions and the dire economic conditions in Russia. Putin says he really likes 50 Cent. Now, for those of you that don't know, 50 Cent is a music icon. But Putin then says, or as we call him in Russia, 4 million ruble. That's funny. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Airbnb announced that it is now suspending all operations in Russia and in Belarus. The company's statement announcing the decision reads, "Guests globally will no longer be able to make new reservations for stays or experiences in Russia or Belarus." Brian Chesky, Airbnb CEO, added that reservations starting on or after April 4th have been canceled. This policy change was announced on Twitter. This is a small but essential move. Airbnb is a huge company, and travelers have learned to rely on this service when traveling both domestically and to foreign destinations. Many more U.S. corporations that service Russia and Belarus should be following Airbnb's move. They too must pull out of Russia and Belarus, and they must pull out now. Support for a single-state solution of the Palestinian-Israeli situation is higher now than it has been. A recent survey shows that 33% of Palestinians support the idea that there should be only one state for both Israelis and Palestinians. The study was done by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. Just 3 months ago, 24% of Palestinians supported a single-state solution. The one-state solution is most popular among young people and nationalists. This study indicates several things, but the mainstream population of Palestinians have lost confidence, or are quickly losing confidence in their leadership to bring a resolution to the stalemate. This number represents the highest number in 30 years of surveys on this subject. If there were to be a single state, the populations would be split evenly, with about 7 million Israelis and 7 million Palestinians. The results of these studies suggest a troubling future in terms of resolving this issue. As we've been talking about, Israel has seen an uptick in terror, and yet the international media is reluctant to call it terror. Instead, they rewrite the events, placing blame on Israel. Here is a recent Reuters news agency release. Israeli forces shoot dead Palestinian after Tel Aviv bar attack. Well, yes, but only after the Palestinian perpetrated a terror attack that killed 3 people. That detail was omitted from the original release. Only after a huge backlash did Reuters rewrite the lead. Now it reads, Israeli security forces on Friday shot dead a Palestinian suspected of killing 3 people in the Tel Aviv bar in the latest attack in a series amid renewed tensions between Palestinians and Israelis. Better, but not quite accurate. It places emphasis and the wrongdoing on the Israeli security forces, and the words terror and terrorists are still not mentioned. The BBC posted this biased portrayal of that terror attack. Palestinian gunmen killed by Israeli security forces after deadly attack at Tel Aviv bar. The Guardian depicts the events this way. Israeli forces kill Palestinian after Tel Aviv shooting leaves 2 dead. It was later altered to read Israel, 2 dead after gunman opens fire in Tel Aviv bar. Fox got it right, but hedged a little bit. Israeli forces kill Palestinian in Tel Aviv shooting leaves 2 dead. Later they altered it to Israel, 2 dead after gunman opens fire in Tel Aviv bar. This is a moral problem. Murdering Israeli Jews simply because they're Israeli and Jewish is terror and racism. How do these people get their information? And they can't possibly have the high ground in this moral inconsistency that they have. Every decent person must label these events properly and condemn the murder of innocent people targeted because and only because they are Jews and Israelis. Michael Bloomberg has joined forces with the Sagol family to help mayors in Israel become better mayors. They have created the Bloombergegal Center for City Leadership at Tel Aviv University. Bloomberg is drawing on the experience he has gained from his own Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative at the Kennedy School for Government and the Harvard Business School. At the launch event at the Tel Aviv University, Bloomberg explained the thinking behind the newly created center in this way. He said, mayors are on the front lines of every crisis, whether it's terrorism or pandemic. The series of recent terror attacks in Israel underscores the urgency of his new initiative, which is aimed at helping mayors confront the most difficult challenges and most pressing crises. Israel has always been an inspiration due to its fortitude and resolve you continue to show in the face of terror. In New York, we are in tremendous gratitude to all those countries who stood by us and helped after 9/11, especially Israel. And one small way we can repay that debt is replicating a program that has been phenomenally successful in the United States, unquote. The Bloombergegal Center will have a significant impact on municipal leadership in Israel. Forbes published its list of billionaires, and Elon Musk tops the list with $219 billion. Miriam, or Miri as she's called, Adelson, hit the list at number 50 with $27 billion. Miri is the widow of Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate. Together, Shelley and Miri created a newspaper, Israel Hayom. Miri remains owner of that paper today. Israel Hayom is the largest newspaper. It's distributed for free across Israel. The thinking behind the paper has always been to challenge the mainstream media in Israel. Media has generally been left-leaning or even extreme left in Israel. So Miri Adelson continues the tradition of philanthropy she and her husband began. Their generous support still is given to education in Israel, education about Israel, and to Jewish causes. The Adelsons were also a very large contributor to Republican causes and candidates. Iran is pointing their finger, and that finger is aimed directly at the United States. They are blaming the United States for the stalemate in the nuke talks. While significant progress was made in the last round of talks, the talks taking place in Vienna have stalled. An Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman did not mince words. He said, the United States is responsible for the pause in talks between Tehran and the world powers in Vienna aimed at reviving their 2015 nuclear deal. Speaking during a weekly news conference, Saeed Khatibzadeh said, America is responsible for the halt of these talks. A deal is very much within reach. Washington should make political decision for the deal's revival. And then he added that Tehran would not wait forever. If it sounds like a threat, it is. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that there is a long history of Muslim anti-Semitism? As you do know, by now, I prefer to call it Jew hatred as opposed to anti-Semitism. While it is certainly true that there were exciting and wonderful periods of Jewish interaction with Muslims in the Muslim lands, it is wrong not to recognize a virulent strain of hatred that existed and still exists. That strain, which began a very long time ago, still exists to this day, and it is found all over the world. It must be clearly understood that the hatred of the Jew in Muslim and Arab lands was not at all based on the principles that are found in European anti-Semitism. While cartoons and caricatures of Jews and stereotypes and myths about Jews abound in both Muslim and European cultures, and while they are very similar in certain ways, they are more different than they are alike. Muslim-Jew hatred is rooted in theology. There is a deep theological issue in the Quran and the Hadith. The Hadith is a collection of sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, creating and dealing with the Jews. At first, mentions of the Jew, it seems more positive, but later they change. Muhammad was not happy that the Jews did not convert to his Islam. So, in an act of one-upsmanship, Muhammad changed the tradition of Islam, one-up Judaism. He changed prayer to 5 times a day instead of 3 times a day. He changed fasting from one day to a month, one day like Yom Kippur, to a whole month, Ramadan. And finally, he turned his back on Jerusalem and prayed towards Mecca. Jew hatred of an entirely different order. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.